We're building a website right now, because this will be an online document, and the website we're building will host that document. And in our public engagement, we'll shift to more of a rolling out the draft plan, hopefully in a digestible way, an understandable way for the public, realizing that it's a big document, even though we're trying to make it as small as possible, as succinct as possible, I should say. It's still going to be a lot of information for people to understand and absorb and react to. So we're working through the best way to do that right now. But right now we're sort of in the middle of that writing the text, building the website phase. Next slide. So as we're drafting the plan, we're thinking about our vision statement. That is our sort of the umbrella that sits on top of the plan, and everything we do within the plan kind of ties back to that vision statement. And this is the vision statement here in its most succinct phrasing, but there are supporting statements that give a lot more detail to what that vision statement means. And so everything we do throughout the draft will be tied back to this vision. Next slide. And then our goals are sort of that next level down, and they begin to talk about how we achieve the vision. So they begin to get a bit more into that action-oriented aspect of the plan. And there are 10 goals as it stands right now that you all helped us develop. And again, based on your input, based on public input, also based on the previous focus plan as well. We took a lot of the information from that to determine these goals and our vision statement as well. And so these goals are going to be one way that you can organize the plan's recommendations. So each of these goals will have a section on the website. You'll be able to see all the recommendations or link to all the recommendations that relate to those and the various objectives. You'll see a relationship back to the vision statement as well. So it'll all be interlinked as you're looking through the document. But these 10 goals are kind of the organizing framework of the plan. Next slide. And then these 25 objectives are really the specific topics, and they have all the recommendations in the plan will live within each one of these 25 objectives. We're working hard to not be repetitive. So a recommendation will only happen once. If it's related to more than one objective, we'll find one that it's its home, and the other places are just linked back to that or referenced back to that. So this is where all the kind of specific topics are addressed and detailed strategies happen. And we are writing these 25 right now. I would say we have rough drafts of maybe 2/3 of these right now, and we're working to get the rest of those done. And then we'll be developing a way to disseminate this information, not just to you all, but to the public, to city staff, to elected officials, to management here in City Hall as well, to get all of this information reviewed. And it's going to be a lot to get through, probably spread out over several months, right? So, but anyway, that's the process we're working through right now. Next slide. And then, of course, the implementation matrix, once we have all of these recommendations drafted and within these objectives, we'll have this matrix created that talks about our timeline. How do we measure success? What are some KPIs or metrics we can use to determine whether we're succeeding or not? Who's responsible for implementing these things, and who are some potential partners, and what are some potential funding sources, and what are the generalized costs and things of that nature? So the implementation matrix will kind of be that sort of final piece that we create once we have all our objectives reviewed and everyone's comfortable with the strategies and community supported actions that are within those objectives. Next slide. And so thinking about the recommendations, this is a screenshot of our plan recommendation database. We took every plan in the city all the way back to the focus plan. We put all the recommendations into a database. We tagged all of those recommendations based on a number of different keywords. And so we have this database set up where you can search for recommendations related to different topics, where you can search by keyword, you can search for all the recommendations in a specific plan. And so this just gives you an idea of how we plan to structure the database of recommendations within the comp plan. It'll be something like this, where you can search by strategy session or by keyword or topic or anything like that. So we're going to make it user-friendly. And of course, we'll have all the other planning documents in that database as well. So we just wanted to go over that to give you an idea that as we begin to distribute or drafts of things for people to react to, that you're kind of familiar with the overall structure of the plan, how it's going to be organized, and then ultimately how it will work, as a document when it's done. Next slide. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions or comments. Do we have anything in the chat?
Nothing in the chat yet, but y'all can have to hand up if he has theirs up.
Have you guys talked with the other departments? Has their input and strategic ideas been incorporated into this already?
Yeah, Vicki, one of the first things we did when we started was to start that conversation. We've since had 1 or 2 technical meetings internal,
Okay.
and they've identified their staff members. And part of their recommendation database was making sure that we were looking at the recommendations from their plans as well. So a lot of those are public works plans or sustainability plans and things like that. Yeah, that will be a primary component. We're also trying to figure out a way to work through MARC and let other communities comment or be aware of our plans. We don't know how much we're going to let them dictate, what we should or shouldn't do, but at least to be aware of what they say and how it impacts them. There's always good that can come out of that communication.
And will the Empowerment Committee have a chance to review the recommendations in the actual format before it gets sent out to everybody else?
We haven't quite figured that out yet. Right now, we're trying to make sure that we can get all of the recommendations out and reviewed and back in time. But yeah, the intent was to make sure that everybody can review it for sure.
Yeah, I think that if it goes out to us at the same time it goes out to everybody else, it's going to be confusing to deal with feedback. And I think there's probably some issues in here that the committee is going to want to have more conversation about and debate before it gets distributed.
Okay, I see Bobby Baker just joined us as well. Are there any other comments or questions about the plan structure, the organization of the draft, the website, the Power BI database, anything like that?
And I might, this is Jeff, I'm going to ask the group to think any things we presented you have questions on, not clear, getting your feedback on how we're structuring things at this point is critical for us, because we want to make sure that we are putting everyone's hard work into an understandable and accessible format and framework. So, because otherwise I'll take the silence that they loved absolutely everything they saw and there's absolutely no questions about anything. And if not, now there's a lot to take a look at, but just give us that thought, because we would just want to make sure we're crafting a really great frame for all of this. One thing that anybody really liked, one thing anybody had any trepidations about.
Are you talking about the format?
Yeah.
And you can feel free to enter anything into the chat that you'd like, or you can just unmute and go ahead.
And as it comes up through today's presentation, or just in thinking about it after today, just really let us know. We really do value your, the opinion of this group. Just where we have you positioned to give us that kind of feedback so we can make sure we're structuring things well. Okay.
All right, well,
All right.
we will go ahead and get started with our draft recommendations for our last two strategy sessions. I'm going to kick it over to Travis and Jay to start us off with livability.
Thanks, Morgan. Just to give you all a quick overview, our strategy sessions have all been based on, building a vision for livability, understanding what it's going to mean to make that vision a reality is essentially what we're talking about. But on the next slide, you'll get what we're describing as maybe an overview of what livability is. And I would love to know if y'all can raise your hand, if your camera's on, if you can use your reaction buttons in Teams, whether or not you have been to any of the livability sessions. I know that Vicky has, and there are others in this room today. I think there's about 11 people in here. The last time I looked, maybe 12. If you have been, then the content that I'm getting ready to share with you really quickly is very similar. Morgan, can you go to the next slide? Livability is like I would say like the micro view of what's happening. It's really neighborhood based. And so it's about community assets and connections, and how do we have those connections physically, socially, culturally? What types of city services do we have? What are we doing about development, particularly when we think about housing and the rising cost of housing? How diverse is our housing stock? How do we eliminate disparities across the board? Specifically, as we think about the neighborhood level for things. On the left is the framework for livability. On the right is the reaction and the comments from participants of our strategy session number 1 about what livability means to them. And so we heard things about, having safe, walkable, clean, diverse neighborhoods, being people friendly, being accessible at all times, respecting our culture, our history, and so on. We went from that conversation, from what's the vision, what's it feel like, to our next strategy session, which is on the next slide. And we started to dig into that a little bit, which is not only what does the word livability mean to you, but how do we make your vision for it start to happen? And so we dug into what makes a great neighborhood. How do you ensure everyone has assets and is connected, and so on? From that strategy session number 1, we went into our second strategy session, which began to give us some idea about what people might think about in terms of a strategy to accomplish their vision. And so on the next slide, you'll see some of the conversation there, and you'll see that there were half a dozen topics that we talked about: strong neighborhoods, connected city, amenities or community assets, same thing, infrastructure and city services, housing affordability, and again, how to eliminate disparities. We were exploring those strategies, but also asking everyone to give us their feedback on what elements inside of those things are most important. So we heard things about transportation options and investing in our infrastructure and doing asset-based planning and making sure that we look at our area plans and apply the recommendations for those. But all of those conversations, strategy 1 and 2, led us to strategy number 3, which is how we begin to share with the community just a selection of recommendations for the comprehensive plan based on the 6 topics that you see on screen now. And as we shared those at strategy session 3, which you'll see on the next slide, we were asking some of the same questions that we're going to be asking you all today, which is what's missing, what needs clarity, what needs to be stressed more, are there equity concerns? And I know from the empowerment community perspective, you all have had a pretty early in the planning process conversation about what equity is supposed to mean. I remember from that conversation, I feel like Bo and Morgan was at about 9 months ago, maybe. When you were talking about that, you were talking about being able to enjoy your neighborhood without having to leave and go somewhere else to get the things that you need, and that being really important. So we're hearing a lot about investment when we think about equity in Kansas City, and what does that mean as we think about clarity and assets and so on. So what we want to do now is I will give it to Jay to go through the recommendations, and we have them by topic. So I'm going to put into the chat capital letters, and it'll say each topic that we're talking about today. We'd love for you, as we go through that, to share your thoughts as you have them on these topics. Again, what's missing, what needs clarity, and so on. You can put it in the chat. We're recording this meeting so that we can grab the chat when we're done, but comment however you feel the most comfortable. With that, I'm going to give it to Jay to talk about strong and desirable neighborhoods and the recommendations for that.
Thanks, Travis. So yeah, definitely we have a ton of recommendations, and it's a lot of text. A lot of these things we're talking about don't don't lend themselves very well to graphics or maps because they're policy based, and so there's a lot of text, there's a lot of things to go through. So we'll go kind of quick, but definitely just feel free to unmute yourself, shout out, type in the text, raise your hand. We'll keep an eye on things and want to get your feedback. Just like Director Williams said, very valuable to us. But we do have a lot of stuff, so I'm gonna keep rolling through. And like Travis said, it's important to remember what this strategy session was about. It was really about the neighborhood and kind of people's daily life experiences. And you're going to see a lot of overlap here between livability and serviceability, and also between with mobility and visibility that have previously been codified. So we did talk about a lot of the same topics. We talked about transportation, we talked about infrastructure, different things with all these different topic areas, but they all had a little bit of a different bent to them, so that when we're talking about infrastructure here, it's more that kind of neighborhood scale, the stuff people see every day, versus infrastructure and serviceability is more the big things underfoot, things you might not see, flood control, things like that. So that's just kind of a bit of a reference for this. Morgan, you want to go on? There we go. So on each of these, we're just going to go through one of the recommendations for each of the topic areas, and then we've got those questions. Travis said, what's missing, what needs clarity, what needs stressed, are there other equity concerns with this, and any other additional suggestions for implementation. So this first topic area was ensuring neighborhoods are strong and desirable. First recommendation is to review land use policies, identify necessary amendments to policies like land use designation, zoning, subdivision regulations, design standards. A few, and generally these will be codified as the strategies and action steps. So the larger bullet point is more of a strategy statement, and the smaller action steps. But these will also be further refined as we develop the objectives and strategies with the plan. So just a few elements there: eliminating parking minimums, facilitating accessory dwelling units, and updating design standards to encourage all modes of transportation. And Vicky notes there's a concern about eliminating minimum parking standards. And there was some discussion about this for the mobility. Remember in our empowerment committee late last year, where the recommendation was implementing parking maximums. I know there was some concern there, and that was modified as a result of that suggestion to look more at parking minimums. There are neighborhoods in the city already that have parking maximums in place. Brookside, some areas, I think Market downtown, have parking maximums already codified. So this wouldn't necessarily require parking maximums through the city, but eliminate the minimums, which helps to really increase density, lower cost to development, and keep our development costs in our existing neighborhoods lower.
Jay, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
This is Vicky. In sitting in on the strategy sessions, when we had those throughout the last couple months, I think a lot of the discussion was about where this would be a good idea, and the neighborhoods are particularly concerned about overflow parking when they back up next to either an institution or commercial corridor or whatever, that if we eliminate minimums, people just go straight into the neighborhood, and there's a huge problem with that in parts of the city. So I think what we were talking about before was, if we're going to use this, keep targeting it only in certain places, because I think arguing about it every time a development goes in is difficult. And I think doing this where there are neighborhoods that are vulnerable to taking the excess, and I think also along the streetcar line where people are going to start treating some places like a, where you go a park and ride instead of, a real park and ride. So I think issues like that, we still need to talk about what makes the most sense before we just say that we're eliminating parking minimum.
That's a great point, Vicky, and something I had meant to highlight as well, that the way these or the objectives and the recommendation strategies are being written is a lot of this is intended to be implemented through the area plan process. So, there's a lot of discussion. There was a lot of discussion in the mobility sessions about context sensitivity, different parts of town needing different things. And many of these recommendations are not going to be blanket recommendations for the entire city, but they might be a blanket recommendation that each area plan needs to address this topic. So parking minimums might be one of those things where each area plan needs to address the parking regulations, consider parking minimums or even parking maximums where it makes sense, but not necessarily that we're going to, in one fell swoop, eliminate parking policy for the entire city all at once for all neighborhoods, because we know that doesn't, there's a lot of really diverse neighborhoods here, so it doesn't, what goes in Brookside doesn't necessarily work the same in the Northland or Martin City or other places.
Right. Well, I think the wording of it in this broader document's really important, especially because when developers from out of town are trying to figure out whether they can comply with the plan, they go here first. And then somehow in Kansas City, they figure out they have to go to a specific area plan. And I think if this reflects our overall strategy, then it could say something like parking minimums are eliminated in certain targeted areas for the following reasons or something. So that nobody goes in at this point and says, oh, good, they don't have any parking or parking minimums. When in fact, I'm not sure there's consensus on that message. So maybe it's just the wording, but
I would agree. I think it's the wording, and hit upon 2 points. I mean, there are things we'll find across this. I think looking into citywide plans, I think there's some global considerations. So I think looking at, and it's different in between sometimes eliminate parking minimum versus eliminating, meaning it's something to consider. So it's something that could be applied potentially globally, but to your point, what are those contextual situations? I mean, you began to identify those, depending on what type of area you're in, whether you're on a corridor, or you're in a neighborhood or adjacency to some of those different development areas. I mean, that's.
If we can get that much in there to give some guidance so somebody doesn't just interpret this as and argue for weeks upon end that they don't have to provide any parking, for instance, that I think as far as we can get with where we are aiming this to be helpful, commercial court or, whatever wording.
And I'll say my global consideration and context consideration, I don't think it just fits to minimums, but I think it fits to a good number of the recommendations you'll see in the comprehensive plan. If there's some things globally, and understand that, then there's some things that'll be context-based. And I think the job of this plan is to identify some of the different criteria to consider. There'll be times when you'll consider them on a case-by-case basis, but there'll be other times, and depending on what we're talking about, infrastructure, other things, in certain ways, you'll have to consider them as a whole system. Right. You can't necessarily partially put in place I'm just going to pick on sustainability. You have to look at it across the entirety of the city and how you do that. So I think that should be that's a given and understood probably for everything you'll see from this point forward in today's presentation, and certainly how we structure the comprehensive plan.
That's good. I think the criteria is really important, and partly because you're not going to be able to go back and update 19 area plans right away. And there's going to be natural conflicts in there. So this should take precedent, I would think. So I think that getting at least to the criteria would be important at this level.
And this might be a point for me to bring in, the idea about doing a comprehensive plan. You do it because it's a tool. It's to really help guide, engage, propose development. So one of the things that will be a part of the plan as well is understanding the different audiences that will use this as a tool. It's everything from somebody who's proposing to build something to somebody who is representing a neighborhood where something's to be done. It's for elected officials. It's for somebody who might be incentivizing something to be done. So there's different audiences for this document. So it's global considerations and its context, and it's also the audience, because at the end of the day, we want people to take a look at this document. Hey, I have an understanding about thinking about parking for a particular development, something else. Okay, I'm in an environment where the city looks at parking minimums in a variety of different ways in a variety of different contexts. So that's how this is to be used.
Okay. we've got a lot more to get through. Does anyone have any additional thoughts on this recommendation and the bullet points under it at this time? Seeing none, go ahead, Jay.
All right, next one. So there we go. Enhancing amenities and social interaction within neighborhoods. So this, we also have another section on amenities specifically, but thinking about our neighborhoods, looking at the amenity mapping within neighborhoods, looking for opportunities where we can have more social interactions in our sub areas, identifying additional amenities to fill gaps, and then making sure we're creating or enhancing public spaces that encourage those social interactions, encourage people to experience the neighborhood, interact with their neighbors, schools, local and organizations, etc. Go to the next one, Morgan. And this, I think, is our final on ensuring neighborhoods strong and desirable. It's changing our approach to providing safety. This is all kinds of safety, public safety, traffic safety. So looking at areas where we can target investment in sidewalks, street crossings, and lighting to increase safety for pedestrians, improving transit stops, increasing safety for those transit users, make sure we have investments that make alternative forms of transportation safe for all users, and then incorporating the crime prevention through environmental design, the SEPTED approach in our public and private improvements. And that's primarily things like looking at sight lines, looking at lighting, dark areas, those kinds of things, if you're not familiar with it. Any thoughts on missing parts, things where we need clarity, stress, equity concerns?
I know what we mean when we say non-vehicle, I think, but I also think that maybe a half a word of clarity on what is non-vehicle.
Yeah, primarily what this is talking about is those people on the street outside vehicles, so pedestrians, cyclists, people trying to access transit. And a lot of this is about making it safe, because we have a lot of recommendations in the mobility section about safety, about Vision Zero, and kind of bring this to the neighborhood level, making sure our neighborhood streets, as opposed to maybe big arterial roads, are safe for kids to be out on them, to play on them, to visit neighbors' houses, that kind of thing.
I get that. So what it really is non-automotive?
Yes, non-motor vehicle.
Okay.
Unless you count, I guess, electric motors for scooters and bikes, but no, yeah, cars and trucks, people outside of cars and trucks.
What about my golf cart?
The golf cart discussion has not come up in our Spirit Playbook discussions so far. I know North Kansas City was debating golf carts a little while back, but I don't know if that's one we'll be tackling too much on this.
Yeah. Okay.
We might want to tackle that
discussion.
at some point, because that conversation just came up in in a neighborhood association just last night. It might be something to just put up there on the board and.
Yeah, it's a pretty standard form of transportation in many communities, especially if you're making that 4-block trip, 5-block trip, and a lot of times you're driving it in traffic or on a sidewalk. Yeah, duly noted.
All right. Any other thoughts on these safety measures, things that we are going to be citing in the plan? Seeing none, we can go ahead and move on to Connected City.
All right, Connected City. Again, you're going to see some overlaps with transportation, but this is also thinking about how what we talked about with the public, how we can connect physically, culturally, and socially, in addition to so it's not just about transportation. So physical connection, maybe somewhat obvious or more related to what we just discussed, making investments and choices for all types of transportation option. And this really reflects what was also discussed in mobility, but because we had a lot of people that attended just one of these strategy session tracks, we want to make sure we're covering these things. So develop a transportation master plan is another recommendation from mobility, but it is reflected here as well. And then identifying and enhancing inter-area multimodal transportation routes, system on-street, off-street bicycle facilities, pedestrian networks, again, mirrors what we discussed in mobility. Go to the next one, Morgan. So making sure we are, as we're doing these things, is obviously equity is a huge part of this plan and goes throughout. We have a specific section on eliminating disparities, but as we work to improve things, connect people, we also want to keep an eye on gentrification, on displacement. So developing displacement proofing policies for neighborhoods. Kansas City does some of this already, but building on that, acquiring properties, strategic locations, disposing those properties through competitive processes to meet goals like increasing affordable housing, incremental development, transit-oriented development, or context-sensitive design, and then looking at land use policies, permit, relax for like regulations on incremental infill development projects in unstable single-family neighborhoods, tiny houses, accessory dwelling units, ADUs, the granny flats as they sometimes are referred to, and other entry-level investments. So smaller developers can work on getting new housing stock and affordable housing stock in these neighborhoods.
Hey Jay, in the chat, Vicky's asking if we're talking about the city acquiring property. Vicky, do you want to elaborate on that? Some more thoughts related to it?
No, I just wonder if that's who we're talking about, or if we're going to partner with a not-for-profit or something. The city often doesn't have the resources to do that. I'm just asking if we're setting a goal that they get some.
Yeah, and that's one we toyed with internally as well. We're not exactly sure. We're looking for some direction as well. The city being the agent that holds it may be a challenge to release it. We may also be the right people at certain times too.
Yeah.
So.
And Vicky, I think to your point, it's great to have a blended strategy where we can work with smaller developers or even larger developers or nonprofit agencies or faith-based institutions, and a combination of that plus city resources. So we can come in with that strategy and work to revitalize some of these areas where the housing stock is aged or is no longer existent, but it's still difficult to get the financing, the developers interested. So I think to your point, it maybe is partly city, but maybe is also these other agencies and looking at partnerships and overlays and things like that that can help incentivize this. Other questions, thoughts about this one?
Is there a place where this? Oh, raising hand.
Go ahead, David.
Is there a place that overlays with questions of equity in terms of is there room here to talk about prioritizing as possible residents from places that are experiencing this with also hitting these goals versus I think temptation sometimes can be trying to hit these goals but end up excluding a lot of other residents from it because more mature actors end up being the ones who are carrying out these functions.
Could you restate your question again? Yeah, I didn't quite understand the first part of it.
The question, sorry, prioritizing. Is there room here to talk about for strategic locations and properties and where there's displacement risk of prioritizing also groups already on the ground or residents at risk of displacement in also providing this affordability, this incremental development, et cetera, beyond just having affordability provided by external actors?
I think I follow what you're saying. Basically, it's so that if we provide a program, it's not utilized by people who have more resources than who the intended audience is. And so that, and tell me if I'm wrong on that, and just make sure that we structure it when we possibly can in that fashion. Is that generally what you're suggesting?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, an example here is for New York City. I was doing refinancing for affordable housing, and there's a program done for a lot of the tax seizure properties in neighborhoods where they were trying to hit affordability metrics with the use of it, and they partner with the Ford Foundation on saying, let's, when possible, train up and prioritize the disposition of these properties to minority contractors or anyone with real estate experience in those neighborhoods could play that development function. They call it the Neighborhood Entrepreneurship Program. As I said, agnostically, we're about to basically dispose of and incentivize a huge amount of affordability projects in these neighborhoods. And they said, let's take that extra step to incentivize actual residents from these neighborhoods and stepping into building up a track record and being able to develop their own development shops through this program instead of just agnostically trying to hit affordability and anti-displacement metrics.
Yeah, David, I think those are great points, and I think that does play in a little bit to the next one, and then some stuff we have in eliminating disparities that is about that, and kind of equipping existing residents or existing neighborhood associations and kind of getting them some of those resources, some of that training. But I think that's a really good thing that we can add to this as well to bolster this. Morgan, you want to go to the next one? I think that'll kind of transition nicely into that. So this is not exactly what you're saying, David, but similar, and we heard a lot from the public about focusing on the neighborhood associations. We have a really great network of neighborhood associations in the city already. We could expand that as well. So we want to support those existing neighborhood associations and empower them, and also help create new neighborhood associations where it makes sense. So we can explore enhanced neighborhood service delivery programs, support those neighborhood associations and leaders, assisting the neighborhoods in completing self-assessment processes to identify challenges and opportunities and tailor services accordingly. Again, this gets back to kind of making sure that what we're doing is very, very context specific and works well for that neighborhood throughout the entire Spirit Playbook plan process, really. And then providing information that will enable the neighbors to improve their livability, work together, build connections, and work on common issues and problems together. So really all about supporting those existing neighborhood associations or increasing our support for them and resources for them and help create new ones as well where it makes sense.
So I guess to check back in with David, so was it the idea about prioritization, see them implying in both, but you'd be looking for some statements as it relates to kind of prioritizing access to resources to support these improvements with folks that are currently working in areas or existing residents? Is that where you were heading?
Yeah, I think it still might sit as language. This is great. Like, I like the slide a lot. It still might sit as language in the last slide of more who are, who are the actual developers and partners and teams that are delivering and prioritization through that effort versus falling in a place where you're trying to hit just numbers of affordability, but then neglecting a lot of those opportunities to actually have residents at risk of displacement or have been excluded from those roles prior being able to step into it. But the neighbor associations being built up also certainly helps. It's just, or they aren't necessarily the ones that may be providing those affordability metrics of the last slide.
Yep. That's great. I think that's a good enhancement.
It sounds like a more comprehensive view of what you're talking about when you talk about displacement and all the players that are part of it. Because it's not just the people who are living there, right, that are experiencing it. They can be empowered and through training, et cetera, as well, to help change their neighborhood. But you're also talking about the people who are already doing that work and creating those connections.
Yeah, and using the chance for that extra bit of effort or finding partners to cover it. I mean, I think the city of New York basically said we aren't willing to cover the extra cost here, but the Ford Foundation stepped in, so they're willing to cover the extra cost, which is not great form on the part of the city of New York, but they found a way to make that work.
Excellent. Thanks for that. And Vicky, I see your comment in the chat about the neighborhood self-assessment being a process that's worked in the past. Thanks for that comment. I think that's what we have for Connected City. The next one goes into community assets. And this was kind of making sure that our neighborhoods have those community assets within the neighborhood where it makes sense, and trying to incentivize and create complete neighborhoods that people can have the assets they need that they want to see within their neighborhoods. They're not necessarily having to travel across town to get to them. And obviously, there's market pressures that can limit this, but doing what we can to promote that. So this first one is defining assets. Specifically defining what are the assets that we're talking about, specifically private, public, different types of assets, then mapping them, identifying gaps, and marketing to support them. So create a neighborhood asset mapping as part of the area plans or neighborhood self-assessments, identifying gaps and getting additional input on investment options, and then always considering maintenance and enhancement of existing assets opposed to new, particularly when we're talking about the public assets. See, Vicky's got her hand up.
I think these are two objectives that are about the right specificity to figure out what our goal is and what we're trying to do. So if let's say these stay intact with no change in wording, then they would go in the implementation matrix. Each would have a spot, and then you guys would propose who's in charge, who's the partner, when is it supposed to be done by, etc. Is that what you guys are thinking?
That's correct, Vicki. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
All right, next one, Morgan. So then once we know what the assets are, where they are, where we have the gaps, developing context-sensitive neighborhood-informed amenities, introducing recreational activities, public art, open spaces, neighborhoods based on identified gaps and desired residents. We can go to the next one. And then also, while we're thinking about this again, thinking about equity and displacement potential with this, balancing the introduction of more community assets while minimizing displacement, making sure we're considering the potential for displacement impacts of transformative projects in neighborhoods. And Vicki, I think you got your hand up, but you made a comment in the chat as well.
Sorry, my hand's not up.
Oh,
sorry.
Maybe it's up from earlier. Yep, no problem. Yeah, and another comment about nonprofit partners. I think for sure, and for-profit partners as well. And we're talking about things like grocery stores and retail outlets. What we can do to partner with the public sector, with the nonprofit, and what the city can do itself. And that's what we have for community assets. Any thoughts on any of these? What's missing? Needs clarity? Needs stressed? All right, we can jump into infrastructure and city services. And because we do have our entire section on serviceability, which is very focused on infrastructure, we really frame this one as how to do decision making for these neighborhood scale infrastructure elements, things like sidewalks, things like individual storm sewer inlets that are clogged, not necessarily looking at wide scale flooding, but kind of targeted things like that. So it was really about using community engagement and data analysis to make decisions about infrastructure and city services. So this first one is enhancing resident engagement, related to identifying and prioritizing needs and desires within the neighborhoods, like the citizen satisfaction survey, but going beyond that. So enhancing existing resident engagement tools related to neighborhood level investment decision-making priorities, and adopt a policy of seeking input from low-income, historically underserved populations first when we're making these infrastructure decisions. And then the other part of that was balancing asset maintenance versus new investment. This is something you'll also see mirrored in the serviceability discussion. but really looking at this fix it first policy. So making sure we're able to spend our money, stay within our means, spend our money wisely, doing complete life cycle cost assessments for maintenance, and really trying to make our money go as far as we can by focusing on what we have now and what we need to fix before we look at building new infrastructure and prioritizing that maintenance of existing over new investments. This is the last one for infrastructure and city service. So any thoughts on these?
Yeah, this is Colby, just kind of curious on what that really means, the prioritization of maintenance of existing infrastructure over new investment. Is that so if a developer is looking at a suburban area that doesn't have the infrastructure serving it right now, but pays as part of the development to put it in, that could get turned down in favor of looking at their neighborhood in a more urban setting? Can you explain that a little bit more? Give me an example of what could happen there?
Yeah, I think your example is not what's intended. I think, we have a lot of greenfield area to grow in the city. And it's definitely not the objective of this plan to hamper that. But I think it might be in terms of kind of large scale speculative type infrastructure investments for growth, maybe less of a priority than supporting the existing. So certainly I don't think there'd be something where we'd say, no, developer can't come in and build this. But it might be, maybe we're not extending a road another mile in a greenfield area for potential future investment when we've got all these existing maintenance issues.
Okay.
Kyle or Director Williams, maybe jump in on that one as well.
Yeah, you did a pretty good job over there, Jay. We know with this plan that it would be futile to say no new development. That's not what we're trying to accomplish. We're trying to set strategies for when that development occurs in greenfield situations, that we're doing it in the most responsible ways possible. So if you see things like that you do not think we're wording correctly, we don't wish those to be triggers for that, but we do want this to be a decision-making document that prioritize, should you build in that new area versus maybe into something. So any language that supports that is what we're after.
And I think some language regarding global considerations, again, about this investment and others, things that we would look at in terms of everything from sustainability to supporting community, to opportunity for economic development. I think having some of those global considerations as you do that balancing of it. I think it might be more about the balancing and then global considerations. I mean, that's really what leads to a priority. We have two, different ways of treating a similar thing. We want to be balanced in how we make those investments. What are those considerations that we'll be looking at, when we're in the case of having to look at limited resources and putting them towards maintaining something versus expanding something.
I think Nikki has her hand up though.
Yeah.
One of the things I was going to add, Colby, because I think this issue in Kansas City is always going to be on the front burner and always going to be an issue just because of our geography, et cetera. But in focus, when we got to this point, the final compromise, which frankly was between Northland leadership and Urban Core leadership, was that the priority would, in new areas, the priority would be on adjacent development first, would be the city's first priority. So you don't just leapfrog over one development into something else and then you pay for all the stuff in between. And that they identified priority development zones, which helped people figure out where that actually was. And if you were outside that, you'd still get city approval if it was worth it, but the developer would pay for all of that themselves. And in a priority development zone, you might get more city help to help pay for the public infrastructure required for your project. So nobody was telling anybody no, it was just a matter of what the developer would have to pay for themselves. And then the second part of that was that sometimes, like Jeff said, these are not apples and oranges where, say, the Waldo area needs sidewalks desperately, but the Northland's talking about some completely different kind of larger housing development. They don't cost the same amount of money. And so I think if we can keep the conversations on those things with you guys at Plan Commission and the council, et cetera, and especially at PIAC, where they distribute some of this kind of money, that we realize that every part of the city needs stuff. They just cost different amounts of money. And that to say, you know, it's taking too much to fix the urban core, you know, we want the same amount of money, that may not be anywhere near the same amount of money it would take to fix problems in a growth area. So I think there's a way to give people some tools to resolve that, because it is a constant argument. And I think some leadership, and it's hard for the council to tell anybody no. So I think some parameters would at least help on cooperation with particularly new development as opposed to infill development.
Kobe, does that answer your question? And then follow up, do you have any thoughts on other ways to kind of describe this, or make sure that we're getting our point across, that we're not saying, you know, no new development?
Yeah, I think it's the way you explained it to me originally. It seemed like it was more geared towards like Vicki said, it's a capital improvement, you know, and PIAC spending kind of thing, and versus actually looking at a development that wants to develop somewhere, you know, someplace in the city. So it's more of a public spending of dollars and where it goes and how it's actually spent and analyzed before it's actually implemented. And that makes sense. What I don't want to do is deter some kind of development that, well, we'd rather you build over here because you could help improve this infrastructure that has an issue here versus putting in new to serve where you want to go. So, you know what I'm saying?
Yep, excellent. That's good, and that'll be good for us to, as we kind of get more detail on this and the objective, to make that clear. That's good information, good feedback. Thanks for that.
Yeah, and I agree with Vicki what she's saying. The fact that the needs in the Northland are a lot different than the needs in the Southland, and how you balance that statement out, and you know, you're able, by having some of that leadership, and as things come in, they can talk about this and best figure out the ways to spend the dollars. So that makes sense.
Excellent.
There is a way, can I just add one more thing, Kobe, to that? There is a way that the city can use impact fees to say, okay, you can build up here, but instead of putting money into a park next to your facility, that park money could be spent somewhere else in the city. And the problem with that, of course, is the legal experts get pretty picky about adjacencies and how broad that can be. But that's a tool used in other cities that sometimes makes up for problems where there's a lot of good pressure for development, but there are still places with huge need in other parts of the city who don't see that as fair. But there's smaller ways you can help. Like when a landfill came in, or the extended one out south, the deal was finally cut that they could put some of their money into a neighborhood development fund for sort of hosting all that traffic and light and other problems, et cetera. So there might be ways you can come up with smaller ways to sort of compensate for the fact that this is just a normal problem between new growth and infill. And Kansas City's overall problem is that we're sprawled out too much, so we can't pay for everything we want or need, and we have to come up with solutions somehow. So there's some ideas maybe from other cities on that too.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks for that, Vicki. Okay, so keep rolling here. Got a lot more to cover still. So I got housing affordability, equality, and diversity is our next topic, subtopic. So explore strategies, encourage adaptive reuse of existing developed and underdeveloped properties, looking at ways to increase implementation of adaptive reuse strategies, including brownfield redevelopment, adaptive reuse, underutilized property, infill development on underdeveloped properties. The next one, Morgan. So also in incentivizing more rehabilitation of existing housing stock rather than new construction, exploring implementing tools such as inclusionary zoning, workforce housing credits, other developer incentives to rehab existing housing into affordable housing. And then our third one is promoting development of small lot housing and unique housing styles. It gets back to something we already talked about earlier with the accessory dwelling units and other types of housing. But encourage mixed income neighborhoods to review land use regulations, allow multifamily units in more developed areas of the city and greenfields, and consider other strategies like limited equity cooperatives, community land trust, or tenant right to purchase legislation. And I think something that we've talked about a few times here are these public-private partnerships or partnerships with nonprofits that could go into this as well. So any thoughts on these for housing affordability, what we're missing? Needs more clarity, needs to be stressed, other equity concerns for us with these. All right. So then our final topic for livability is eliminating disparities. And go to the next one, Morgan. So this again sort of ties back to what David mentioned earlier, not exactly the same with development, but making sure our neighborhoods have access to city resources and processes and are able to be educated on basic city resources and processes, exploring new development options, provide housing, training, employment opportunities on the same site, and generally making sure that the people who need access to city services have the ability and the education and knowledge of what those city services are and where they can get them. The next one. Also promoting more equitable public health outcomes and access to housing, jobs, education, and services. This is a lot about back to that transportation element, implementing needs-based priority framework for multimodal infrastructure investments so we can make sure people they feel safe and have the spaces to recreate, walk and bike if they want to, and also get those transportation purposes if they don't have access to a car, and make sure they have transit in a reasonable distance from their house or able to walk or bike to jobs or essential services, healthcare, those kinds of things. Last one, rethinking cities' infrastructure investment allocations more equitably distribute resources based on need. Looking at developing those categories of need first, looking at government requirements, infrastructure improvements, sustainable development, natural resource protection, equitable access, and others. So we have a very defined framework of need, and then working with the communities, particularly in those underserved areas, to populate the categories of need and invest in infrastructure improvements where the greatest needs are identified. So looking at this both from a citywide perspective for these investments and also from an area plan or neighborhood perspective. So again, what are we missing? What do we need to add? What needs maybe more clarity or more stress? Other equity concerns with these recommendations?
Go ahead, Vicki.
This might be, you can push this off to a different section if you want, but I have kind of a parochial question about the transit system in that Kansas City funds the majority part, Kansas City, Missouri funds the majority of the KCATA. And in the last maybe 10 or 15 years, the suburban areas have put on a lot of pressure to have better service in the suburbs, which of course is more expensive because they have to drive farther and it takes longer and, you know, all those kinds of issues. But that I think has been a little bit at the expense of covering our own service area. And I think out of all the things we've talked about, one of the things that crosses all of them is that I think the most important issue about mobility and neighborhood livability and everything is to improve the transit system big time. And whether the city has to put more funding into that to get our level of service, or whether we need to come up with some other kind of strategy, because we don't get much help from the state. That I think the bi-state thing and you know, the makeup of the ATA board has more people from the suburbs on it than Kansas City, Missouri. So I think transit's one of the biggest things. If we could pull it off, that would help with livability and helping neighborhoods that have been neglected to come back. And if it were a very strategic plan with ATA, I just think out of all the infrastructure needs we need, the city overall needs better, reliable public transit. And it's not really their fault that we're not getting it. I think there's a whole lot of factors at play, but I think somewhere in here, if we could just emphasize that public transit's one of the most important things any livable city can provide. It'd be nice to put it in here somewhere. And I'm not sure where, and I'm not sure if it's here in mobility or wherever, but I don't think it's exactly equally, I don't think some of the other issues of transportation are equally important. I mean, we have an obvious or automobile-oriented arterial system that's working pretty well, et cetera. We're working on bike and pedestrian stuff, but I think the transit stuff, you know, the streetcar, as much as some of us fought to get that, is not going to serve what the underlying bus network does. And they have to work together for either of them to work. But I don't know if people agree with that or not, but I'm just throwing it out there because it concerns me, and we keep reading stuff about how their funding's even worse than it used to be, et cetera. So,
Yep.
And Kansas City, Missouri has to stick up for their own transit system.
Well, Vicki, I could use your comments to indicate that really, I think this is a good example, and public transit is one of them. Is certainly this is a plan that talks about future development for Kansas City, Missouri, but there are certain things that we will do on our end, but there really still needs to be a regional understanding of it and funding of it and support for it. So I know even the KTA is talking about what is a regional-wide funding strategy to put in place a transit network and fund it equitably across the region. I think this is one of those many points that talk about, you know, hey, our bus lines just don't stop at our borders, and that they're going into adjacent communities.
I think that's fine, and I think that's generous, but I think in reality that's been used against us. And I think the people who paid for that issue are the people in the urban core who live there and rely on transit, don't have a car, only have one car, whatever the issue is. And I think all that stuff rhetorically sounds great. And I think we've done great things to improve that. But their active position on the ATA board has made that funding inequitable, I think. And we pay for most of it. We subsidize their service. So if we're going to do that, then I think we ought to at least try and get our own bulked up to where it needs to be. I'm all for the metro thing, but you know, frankly, they don't need it as much as we do.
Well, my reply about that would be the way in which we're understanding and talking about, maybe a better word is balancing that, balancing the provision and funding of transit infrastructure for residents while understanding what some of those needs are to provide transit outside of our own borders, or for our residents to have access to it.
Or even if we put a criterion that says if it helps our people get jobs or get them to jobs, you know,
well,
okay.
And I think that's the idea. It's not us doing it out of the goodness of our hearts. I think it is first and foremost facilitating residents in Kansas City, Missouri to get to the places they need to get to. And that could be employment centers outside, et cetera, et cetera. I just think it's one of those balance points.
You're more generous than I am, Jeff. So that
well, I'll be direct. I'm not being generous. It's just that I just know that there are other elements here, you know, even within our own city sometimes where it's like us versus them. And if we pick language one way or the other there, it feels like it paralyzes us. I think that talking about balance and having, global considerations and balance, we need to get there. This is a vision plan for 20 years out. So I hope that we have time to get that understood. I mean, the nice thing, the thing at least that I feel like I am hearing, maybe a bit more than I've heard when I first got here, is that there's even an interest in some of these outlying areas to have any form of connectivity to us. Because for so long, we weren't here, or people like, don't bring the bus to my neighborhood because of all the problems the bus brings. It's the other way around. People are clamoring for service. I think we're taking this conversation to a place of things that do talk about that have physical ramifications. Like, for example, even if we're going to incentivize something in terms of a job center, should we be facilitating or incentivizing a job center or have land use policy to recommend that to a place where we don't have access to transportation? I mean, so it all can kind of come together to really be able to look at people's interest in transit and demand for more service, and saying it's not just, hey, we're going to give you money to run a bus line everywhere. It's maybe you need to be locating things better. Maybe you need to be leveraging opportunities.
Pretty good job of trying to strategize and keep their busiest routes above water. But I really think somewhere along the line, like 20 years from now when we're all gone, somebody's got to interpret that statement. And if that's a place where we might fall down and it hurts the rest of all these goals about equity and livability and neighborhood livability, then I just think in here somewhere we've got to at least put some emphasis on transit. We don't have to say it's at the expense of anybody else, but we ought to build up our own, or at least support building up our own.
Yeah, I think for the populations that are most reliant on it within our city, having a network that supports them, both within the borders of the city and throughout the region.
Yeah, maybe that's the right wording.
And the tape is rolling, so good. We can capture the language, but good, yeah.
Yeah, that's great feedback. And I will say that we heard over and over and over again in mobility that transit was the most important thing we need to focus on. So you're not the only one saying that, and that's definitely an important part. And this is a good discussion on how we frame that transit discussion. So we are going to run into serviceability. I think we've had some good comments and questions so far, and so we can try to get through a little bit of this. I'll turn it back to Travis.
Yep, I know we have 15 minutes, so I'll be quick about this. If livability is a neighborhood level, and you see my fingers, I'm really tight down to the neighborhood level, my home, my neighbor's home, et cetera. Serviceability is the systems that we have that service all of those neighborhoods across the city. And we think about that, it's a man-made system, but it's also a natural system. So in our first strategy session, we start to dig into that. And what did it mean to make investment decisions related to those systems? What projects did you want to pursue, and so on? Going on to the next slide, it'll give you an overview of what we're talking about when we are talking about those systems. You've got transportation, you've got the healthy environment, our investments, and so on. Participants of strategy session 1 talked about access to resources, the availability of city services, how we're going to maintain and enhance those. That began to inform what the vision might be, thinking about those topics, those enhancements. In the second strategy session, which shows in the next slide, and Morgan, for time, I'm just going to skip one more, go to the next one. We were talking about how do we make the vision and some of those topics a reality. And just like in livability, we centered our conversation around 5 topics. Livability had 6, this had 5. Infrastructure and city services, again, critical natural resources, growth, our aspirational and major projects, and then what does it mean to collaborate as a region? We know Kansas City is the biggest city in the region, so we have lots of partners, and the things that we have here also benefit some of our neighbors. And Vicki, you just mentioned transportation, which is a major thing, just an example of a system. Going from strategy session 2 into 3, we were talking about, okay, given the ideas that people shared about things we might want to tackle, what types of things, what kind of action should we take? What's that look like? And so we had a conversation about the things that we're going to show you on the next several slides. And like the other conversation, we want to know what's missing, what needs clarity, think about equity and what kind of equity concerns do we need to be tackling and making sure that we address, and also share what other suggestions that you may have. So with that, I'm going to give it back to Jay.
Thanks, Travis. So like I said, this is really kind of big picture, a lot of these things and big citywide initiatives. So the first topic in serviceability was focusing on the most needed infrastructure and really prioritizing what we're building, where we're building it. So the first part of that was making sure we're preserving our natural resources and systems first. So identifying those key natural resources, systems, creating metrics for success, implementing conservation strategies, using natural systems to manage stormwater runoff. I'm sure lots of you know, a lot of this is already in place in some way, shape, or form with the stream buffer ordinance, with the BMP stormwater treatment recommendations. Also expanding network of trees and natural areas, making more efficient use of the built environment to reduce pressure on greenfield development. This gets back to that infill development, densification, being flexible with our land use, residential zoning, and then also promoting regenerative, ecologically healthy soils and landscapes. The second one gets back to prioritization and equity and asset management, focusing on those areas of greatest need first. So prior to identifying a system, prioritizing competing infrastructure needs, we kind of discussed that. We've got different needs in different areas. We've got different growth pressures in different areas, but doing all that, finding a way to prioritize that with our limited resources, also reflecting comprehensive plan goals and community satisfaction survey results, defining geographic areas of need as part of the framework for most needed projects, such as sub-area planning boundaries, residential areas, businesses, different zip codes, and then making recommended improvements based on the priority within that framework. So where are we making our investments for sidewalks, water, sewer? We're incentivizing or building city-owned solar, looking at broadband, all within this network or this framework of the greatest need, investing in the greatest need first. And then the third part, building hazard mitigation and climate change into the decision-making process. We have the climate protection resiliency plan that is in process right now. There's a draft out there for comment. I believe the comments are still, periods open for that still. Incorporating those recommendations into our area plans, ensuring our infrastructure projects follow best practices, adopted policy, using stormwater best management practices, the BMPs, and then reviewing the climate protection resiliency plan during selection and design of infrastructure projects. Make sure those that project from prioritization all the way through construction is thinking about hazard mitigation and climate change. Any thought on these three focus on most needed infrastructure recommendations? Again, what's missing? Are there other things, other ideas you have, things we need to stress? Are there equity concerns with what we have presented here? I need a better mic so I could do the Sleep Stories podcast. This would be my thing, just talking through comprehensive plan recommendations. That'd be the best way to put people to sleep, I think, sometimes. Although you all are a little bit different, engaged.
We have a comment in the chat from Kobe related to green infrastructure. The city needs to work on adopting standards for expectation and installation and maintenance. And that is a very good point. It's important to keep those areas maintained. Otherwise, they're just not going to function properly.
And Kobe, are you thinking with this, is this an issue, a public property issue, a private property issue, or just generally about the way the standards are written today?
Both, and frankly, there are no installation standards for green infrastructure. There's the Green Book that's recognized as a guide, but it is not an adopted standard. So some of the projects we have that come through Planning Commission, we asked them to look at green infrastructure as part of their development of detention systems. And it's hard to tell them that we have to have you put that kind of thing in, because the standard is not there for them to follow. You know, they're like, what is the minimum standard, or what kind of standard do we need to follow for green infrastructure? But not only that, if they do put green infrastructure in as part of their stormwater management, then how does it get maintained? Who gets to maintain that? And who makes sure that it gets maintained? Those are some things I know that need to be worked on and flushed out at some point in time. I have talked to Water Services about it a few times, as well as some of the staff at Planning Department about this very issue. So, but I think at some point we need to start figuring that out. It is important.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. Making sure when we have our action steps in terms of actually adopting these standards, making sure they're formal adopted standards, and especially for maintenance. I know we've all seen that. We have this great bioretention basin or something that 3 or 4 years from down the line, it doesn't look anything of the sort. It's a great addition here. Any other thoughts on these? All right, next one is critical natural resources. This really follows on some of the things with the focusing on greatest need, but really placing greater weight on the recommendations of sustainability and resiliency plans from all different angles. So with mobility, looking at reducing personal car travel, vehicle miles traveled, the energy supply. We heard a lot about the interest in neighborhood level or residential renewable energy and support for that, natural systems, the sustainable water supply and use, homes and buildings, gets back to supporting homeowners and existing homeowners and new homes with efficient construction and sustainability measures in residential buildings, food, improving those healthy and sustainable food access, those resources, and then waste and materials, focusing on how we can divert more waste from landfill, and then also importantly reducing illegal dumping in the city and providing those services that are needed to get that waste in the right place. Thoughts on these recommendations? All right, if we go quick, we might actually get through every one of these. We only have a couple left. So focusing on growth, equitable, context specific, sustainable, and promoted based on criteria. This gets back to somewhat of that growth of how do we, what's the right context, what's the right style of the growth, what's the right location. So having infrastructure maintenance and city services match the scale of development, reading those land use policies and to encourage infill development, adaptive reuse, rehab of existing structures, maximize the use of existing infrastructure, whether it's transportation, stormwater, water, making sure we can focus on this infill. What those investments in infrastructure have already been made, and can keep us from having expanded maintenance obligations, except where we think it's really important to. And then this second one, development priority zones, back to what Vicki was talking about earlier, which was discussed and focused as well, but continuing that focus on those development priority zones and infrastructure cost share policies for new developments, making sure we're not leapfrogging and not unduly burdening the city with future maintenance obligations where we don't have that tax base to help pay for it in the future. And then the next part, oh yeah, go ahead, David.
I think it may be a bigger question than now, but is there anything about alongside kind of encouraging infill development, discouraging low density use as being a tool? That may be a longer discussion, but it seems like those two things may be included in each other, but seem like they're very closely attached in a lot of sections of the city.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of discussion about this question, and I think that really comes down to, like we talked about earlier, we don't necessarily want to discourage greenfield growth, Northland growth, but we want to make sure that we're doing it in a responsible way, that we're not, creating a big maintenance obligation that we can't pay for in the future. So definitely incentivizing the infill brownfield. But yeah, go ahead.
Well, I didn't think of it as greenfield. I thought more, parking lots sitting on low density usage, building suburban style things in core neighborhoods.
Okay. Yeah, I got it.
So more from a highest and best use standard. If I'm understanding that right, David, in terms of if we're looking at prioritizing something or putting capital towards it, a couple of things, what is the highest and best use? And highest and best use, maybe not even from an economics perspective, as this highest and best use is the cost of the infrastructure investment balanced out by the density of what's getting created. But there could be some other considerations about return on investment, and that if it's facilitating housing, or if it's helping with sustainability, or if it's providing a community resource. I think that may be the work, some of those global considerations that gets added in to return on investment. Because I think return on investment, people sometimes will just look at it dollar for dollar.
Yep. Yeah.
David, did that get anywhere near, or did that totally?
Somewhat there. I think it's slightly related to it feels like there are a lot of dollars put into, and effort being put into creating energy and density that starts to get, a flywheel of services and amenities, and then things that you can use to cross-subsidize affordability and things. But then right next door nearby it, you have things that suck out that flywheel, where it's often people kind of can afford to sit on a parking lot and don't have much incentive to do anything. And so it's one question of, do you have incentives? The other question is, do you actually need discouragements of things that hold back long-term priorities that we're pouring a lot of resources into next door?
Yeah.
Maybe an analogy, and not a fair one, is looking at even understandings if we have uncertain corridors, the minimum of what somebody is going to do in terms of the minimum of a height of a building or density or something else, not about maximizing, but what minimally we would consider as being an investment, along a corridor in which community and others have put lots of investment into making that a strong and robust corridor.
I think that's a really good point. Maybe something we can explore in somewhere more detailed when we're talking about encouraging infill. Is there are ways that, through the development process, if somebody is, we have some of those more minimum standards where if somebody's going to redevelop something and they're just going to build a new service parking lot or something, maybe there's some tools that can be used for that. Yeah, Vicky?
Just thinking about what David was just saying, I think we may want to, there's a real difference between infill development in a highly prized corridor like the streetcar corridor is going to be, and trying to get infill development where we really, really need it into neighborhoods that have been neglected and underfunded. And maybe there are different strategies for that, because a lot of the problem is out of town owners, but it's also just lack of resources, lack of money, lack of financing, et cetera. So maybe those are two different kinds of strategies, because when we pick these, everybody uses them where they don't really need them because they're going to infill eventually anyway, just because of market demand. But the places that really don't have any demand built up, we need to seriously look at how we're going to help with that, because redensifying the city along the places it's already dense is okay, but what we really need to do is fill in the areas like around 18th and Vine where they got an 80% housing vacancy. And those are just, everybody's been looking at trying to get creative about that, but I just think they're two different kinds of strategies, probably two different kinds of encouragements or discouragements, either way, as opposed to
putting them
all together.
Morgan, can you get the next one? We do just have one more here, which gets a little bit to this discussion go back one, Morgan. Just the final one here was encouraging this mix of infill, brownfield, greenfield at different densities and intensities. And so it talks a little bit about that, but I don't think quite as strong as what our discussion is here. So maybe we can review some of this language of how this gets implemented through the action steps. And then the only other category we have. Go ahead.
Before you leave this one, I think to the comments that David and Vicky were making, is this range of, or this type of language regarding these infill opportunities getting to the idea of context and density intensity based upon context. Is this more in the direction you both were thinking?
I think generally.
I think that the last couple of words in strategic areas might be enough to do that.
Also, what did you say, to facilitate higher density development in strategic areas, Vicki?
Yeah, I think.
That
Yeah,
gets you there.
I think that might get at it.
Is this an instance where you want to see some criteria on what a strategic area is when you were talking before about criteria, guidance, conditions, et cetera, to meet in order to do certain things?
Yeah, because, you know, just from experience, people are going to come in and argue that that applies to them when that isn't really what anybody meant.
But having a document with idea,
they get stretched.
having a document that talks about areas in which we're looking to encourage or areas where we're prioritizing to accommodate development or expect it.
Yeah.
Understanding what those factors are. To your point, if you've got a corridor, we have robust transit, et cetera, there might be other things we've already done to encourage infill investment, where in other areas there may be some other factors that we need to consider in terms of the degree of density. You know, is the strategy there just making sure we have people who are willing and putting in investment of a good quality that will build the corridor out and build demand?
Yeah, at some point the market takes over the demand in a corridor like Maine, but trying to get a corridor like Troost into the same situation takes more than like any incentives any of us have available. And to get it into a corridor like Prospect, you know, it's even harder. So it may be that the criteria Travis mentioned could, frankly, the east side just needs to have some incentives. It can't be used in any other part of town. And they don't have any. Everything applicable there could be used on the plaza or any place else. And a developer gets their return on investment a lot better. They don't have any incentive to use the same thing on Troost where they're not sure they'll get it back, and the financing doesn't even cover the gap. So maybe it's just a matter of looking at the criteria or tie it back to the corridors or the neighborhood assessments or something. But until we figure that out, I don't think anything much is going to happen on the east side.
Yeah, that's a great discussion. And I know we are a couple minutes over time, so the last one is kind of self-explanatory a little bit with, we talked about major projects, and typically there was support for major projects. We have a lot of infrastructure funding from the bipartisan infrastructure law that's coming out. So making sure we're capitalizing on that. And I will turn it over to Bo, I think, to talk about the final next steps, or is it Kyle? One of the two.
Was that me or Jeff? I don't know. I'll take it.
Well, Mr. Gerald Williams will start and Mr. Jeffrey Williams will finish off. So it'll be Williams to Williams.
So as I mentioned earlier, we are now writing the plan. We should have a draft of that in the next few months, and we're still working out the details of how we're going to share the draft with everyone for review. So that has not been completely worked out yet. And we'll be working with subject matter experts as well, city staff, technical committee through issues. I know Vicki asked that question earlier as well. So our plan is to release a draft this fall and put it to the city for adoption in December or so. So that's kind of a rough timeline. More detail to come, and appreciate everyone's time. I'll hand it back to Jeff.
Thanks, Gerald. Just a couple of thoughts for this community. First, thank you all for the conversation today, and I do mean that today it was conversation, and I think it just lets me know, and I've also know the role and the importance of this committee in terms of doing the things we did collectively today, which is really vetting language, and hopefully it was a safe space to say that, I don't think this word means what you think it means. Appreciate we got to the fact about equity concerns and understanding those. I think also the comments about identifying opportunities for neighborhood residents to be involved with change in their community. I think the idea about some of the regional considerations and how do we manage those conversations that don't only impact Kansas City, Missouri, but have some effect to our neighboring communities and across the region. Identifying different people who can help implement all of this. The idea this is a tool for things to be implemented, and have we identified some additional folks that we may not typically look towards, socially focused philanthropy, and how does this document help to guide that type of contribution to the city's future growth and development? How are we giving a good roadmap for things like patient capital, things that will take a long time, but somebody who says, I'm here with you. I know it's a long time, but you've got a plan. You've got a plan you've worked out with community and you vetted, and there's a commitment to moving forward in this way. That's the role that I've appreciated this group taking on and looking at all of those considerations. And I appreciate you giving time for all of us to be a bit more back and forth. If you've been in our other strategy sessions, it's been more about to kind of maybe open-ended, people providing feedback. Here, we have a place where we can go back and forth, and we value that and appreciate it. It helps us get things phrased the right ways, looking the right ways, oriented the right ways as we share them with broader audience. That's been the work of this group all along, and we've gotten this far because of that. So I thank you. I thank you very much for that. And I really thank you letting us, our job here is, as planners and planning staff and consultants is always to extract as much as possible, but we also appreciate, in this group to be able to literally kind of to go back and forth. I'll speak for myself. I really appreciate that. It's very helpful for all of us. So with that, thank you. We will be back in touch. We'll keep, pressing you into service. We're getting to the meat of things. And so throughout the course of this, we hope it's been less of us just talking and you all listening and getting interactive. And I think as we get towards the end, we'll just be like, hey, what do you think? And you're just gonna wonderfully overwhelm us with thoughts and opinions and comments and edits. So, which is what we need. So thank you all very much.
But be nice to us.
Oh, that's okay. And thanks for the extra 9 minutes too. Greatly appreciated.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
everyone.
everyone.
Anybody else? Okay.
Thanks,
Thanks everybody.
y'all. Bye-bye.
Appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.